Our club's always been a forum for visionaries, public figures, and decision makers to command attention to the issues of our time and inform the most relevant, compelling, and challenging conversations. Here we offer first-person access to dynamic political, business, and public personality.
The Canadian Club is one of the most important podiums anywhere in the world that a Canadian can speak to, tell Canadians what it is that they think, develop those thoughts. And so I want to thank you for that very, very much.
Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists today.
Through our programs and events, including our youth and young leaders programs, our diversity partnerships, our joint events, and our media and social media opportunities, we offer you access to dynamic political, social, and business figures from abroad and right here at home.
The platform from which the eloquence of Canada has flowed all of that time, whether it be business, education, politics, sports, arts, and culture. If someone wants to say something to Canadians about this country and about the future of this country, this is the venue you choose.
Good afternoon again, everyone. My name is Glenn Parkinson, Canadian Club President and your host this afternoon. And a warm welcome to those of you joining us online at canadianclub.org. Thank you for spending some of your afternoon with us. Since September, we've had over 10,000 people join us and connect in the conversations we've created here, conversations that matter to Canadians. Last week, we heard from a panel of experts on the productivity challenge in our country. Today, of course, we discussed a blueprint for more and better housing. And in fact, we got it underway with some energy over dessert just now, so you'll hear more in just a second. Tomorrow, we host Paul Desmarais III from Sagard, and then Wednesday, we have Rogers CEO Tony Staffieri with us. So very busy week. Please tune in online if you don't have tickets, and we hope you'll join us. And of course, none of this would be possible if it were not for our sponsors and partners. So thank you to Canadian Bankers Association for their season-long partnership with us, Air Canada as our airline partner, and Canada's Forest Trust, who partners with us to offset the carbon impact of our entire season of events. So thank you to all of our sponsors for making this possible. Now, as many of you know, we often invite young leaders to join us at our events, and today we welcome a table from Toronto Metropolitan University to join us. And oh yeah, please do that. Thanks again. I was going to say, maybe it's pointing out the obvious, but housing impacts us in a myriad of ways, but particularly impacted our young people. By the challenge of affordability and access. So I am sure our table from TMU has questions for our panelists. The rest of you, please use the question cards on your table as well. Jot down a question and hold it up, and we'll bring it up to the front and give it to their moderator to include. For those of you online, there's a button on the right-hand side of your screen that says click to submit a question. So please use that, and we'll get it into the flow of the discussion as well. And now it's my pleasure to welcome our panelists. Today we're joined by Richard Joy, Executive Director, Urban Land Institute of Toronto. Richard's the Executive Director of Urban Land Institute. Prior to joining the Institute, he served as Vice President, Policy and Government Relations at Toronto Region Board of Trade. He was also previously a Director at Global Public Affairs, a leading Canadian government relations firm. His extensive public policy experience comes from over a decade of service at Toronto City Hall and at Queen's Park. Jennifer Keesmaat is President and CEO of Collective Marquee and former Chief City Planner of the City of Toronto. Jennifer spent 5 years as Toronto's Chief City Planner, where she was celebrated for her forward-thinking and collaborative approach to city building. Jennifer is on the Advisory Board of Urban Land Institute Toronto and serves on the Singapore Urban Redevelopment Authority's International Panel of Experts. She's also on the President's Planning and Growth Advisory Board for Ohio State University. And finally, the Honorable Lisa Raitt, Vice Chair, Global Investment Banking, CIBC Capital Markets. Lisa joined CIBC 4 years ago after a high-profile series of leadership roles in the public and private sectors. Prior to her current role, she was President and CEO of the Toronto Port Authority. She served on Parliament Hill in key portfolios such as Labour, Natural Resources, and Transport, and was also the Deputy Leader of the Official Opposition. And moderating today's discussion is Tony Keller, columnist at the Globe and Mail, and his more than 30-year career includes being editor of the Financial Post magazine, managing editor of Maclean's, and a TV news anchor on Bloomberg, now BNN Bloomberg. Tony, panelists, the Canadian Club Toronto podium is now yours. Welcome.
All right.
These are comfy.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you all for being here. I want to start by asking each of the panelists to give an elevator pitch. We'll start with Jennifer. A quick summary. What is, in brief, in the 60-second elevator ride up to the top of First Canadian Place, what is the problem that we have that we are trying to solve?
Are you kidding? Are you kidding me? 60 seconds. Okay, 60 seconds. The problem we're trying to solve is that we have a massive crisis. We have, and it's a failure of planning and a failure of execution. That means throughout the housing ecosystem, people with homes with mortgages and people who are living in tents in downtown Toronto, throughout the entire housing ecosystem, everyone is living with a tremendous state of insecurity. And that insecurity is upending the quality of our lives.
Good answer. Richard?
Well, I'll agree with that. And later on, we have another crisis, which, of course, our task force was dealing with both, which is the climate crisis. So you've got these two enormous, more than generational, really existential crises that could arguably compete against each other in terms of the solutions and need to, they can't compete against each other. They need to come into some convergence. And I think that around solutions, and those solutions are hard to come by, as we all know. And that's why we're talking and talking and talking. We're groping for a way to solve these crises, and I think we're getting closer, but maybe we're not quite there yet.
Lisa, over to you.
So I think the issue is that in order to solve this issue, it's going to have to entail regulatory change that 3 levels of government need to agree on. And we sometimes forget that it's one citizen, but they have 3 representatives, and sometimes they have 4 representatives if you have a regional councillor as well. And as a result, there's too many other people to pass the buck. So you need to have some kind of concerted effort amongst all the orders of government to actually impact what the true issue is.
One of the things that I said to all 3 panelists before we started was I said, you know, in politics, you answer the question that you wish somebody had asked rather than the question they actually asked. And I'm glad Lisa took advantage. I told them, please do that. And I'm glad Lisa took advantage of that.
Got more experience.
And please continue to do that. So how, okay, we had a rather
It's not
large
answer period. It's
No, it was a better answer than my question. So that's why I want you to take advantage of this. So again, we'll go down the line here. How are we doing on fixing our rather large and multivariable housing crisis? And I'll start with you, Jennifer.
Well, I think it is the best of times and the worst of times. And for that reason, I actually approach this moment with hope. But I will say it's the best of times because it's almost unimaginable to me, coming from an urban planning background, that at the federal level right now, we have federal ministers and even the Prime Minister talking about the problem of zoning. That's almost unimaginable to me. because no one really knew what zoning was or cared about what zoning was or made the connection that there was this very technical problem that was limiting and inhibiting our capacity to build more housing. So the fact that we have, in some ways, building on exactly what Lisa has indicated that we require, we're in this kind of phenomenal moment where every single level of government, and this is what happens in a crisis, right? It's staring you in the face. No one can ignore it any longer. Personally, I thought we had a crisis 15 years ago already, and I was seen as some kind of radical that I was always saying, hey, we've got a housing problem. And now, I'm getting invited to stages like this, and I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool. Everyone wants to now talk about this. So that's the best of times part, is that all levels of government are keenly focused on this. And there's a little bit of intergovernmental competition going on right now, that everyone wants to own this, and everyone wants to show that they're doing the most to solve this problem. That's the best of times. The worst of times is that we have a whole series of, I would call, cultural problems that have been generated over the course of the past 20 years that are deeply ingrained in how we govern, how we administer through the bureaucracy, that leads to how we build, and that culture doesn't change because a politician makes an announcement. And the magnitude of the disconnect between the politicians standing up and saying, here's all kinds of money to build housing and we're going to build it really fast, and then what's happening on the ground, the gap between those two things would make you crazy if you experienced it every day as I do. And I'm happy to give some examples of that, but it would almost make you crazy because you're like, hey, don't you watch the news? Don't you hear what the politicians are saying about doing this quicker? And then you get into the bureaucratic shit show where where you slowly disassemble. And, as I said to my table, a project where on Friday I basically went, well, I guess I'll go to the OLT. I'll take 2-3 extra years and spend $1.5 million or $2 million to get 30 extra units on a building because I'm dealing with a B-level planner who just doesn't get it and apparently doesn't listen to the news. That's the worst of times.
Yeah, this is an 18.
Remember, there was a best of times.
This is an 18 and over program, so I think we can, we can use strong language. Richard, best of times, worst of times. Where do you want to come down on that?
Well, I think it's one of the most encouraging parts of the times we're in now is that we're having a ton of these kinds of conversations. And we were talking earlier about a similar moment around transit infrastructure when we were talking a lot but not doing a lot. Well, eventually we started doing a lot. So maybe this is the precursor to doing a lot, and that's an optimistic point of view. I do think, though, that there's maybe a little bit too much over-reliance on a few of the areas of where things are stuck. I get approvals, and I think that approvals are probably less now a public policy issue and more of an implementation issue. The B-level planner, the person behind the building code desk, what have you. I mean, we need to get the machinations of actually delivering public policy better in place, and that's going to take maybe some resources as well as mind space. But I think we also need to understand it's not just that we're not getting things approved and ready to go. I think we maybe rely a little bit, and this may be a bit of a theme for me today, a little bit too much on the private sector side of the equation, which is now about 95% of what we do. And whether we go to double digits or even, as our task force suggested, even up to 20, 30, 40%, which I know a lot of people say, yeah, but how are you going to get the money to do that? Non-private sector, we need to catch up with other countries around what we're doing that competes with the private sector, because there's enough housing that needs to be built by public sector, not-for-profits, and private sector, that no one's going to be running out of things to do and money to be made. But we just need to make sure that we're broadening our approaches. And I think that goes beyond permissive zoning and the machinations of approvals. I think that goes into some other spaces that we'll talk hopefully a bit more about in this session.
And Lisa, I want to ask you to pick up on something that Jennifer mentioned, which is we're in a situation where we have a lot of politicians at a lot of different levels of governments of a lot of different political parties making announcements on housing and talking about housing, which is a big deal. How do we get from that to actually accomplishing things and fixing the crisis? Where is there a gap, and how do we cross that gap?
Well, I think Jennifer's right. I mean, the politicians make the promises, but they have to be implemented by the officials and the bureaucracy. The adage in the federal service is, you know, advise and implement. So they advise without fear, and then they implement without delay. And you need to make sure that that continues, and the government has to follow up on it. The interesting thing for me, though, is the role that civil society is now playing. And we've talked a little bit about it in the concept of, you know, why is Pierre Poilievre talking about housing when my government didn't talk about housing? We barely talked about it. It wasn't a federal issue. Well, he's talking about it because he's being talked to by really significant parts of the population that they are very concerned about it. So, and this isn't an advertisement, but look at what the campaign is. It's axe the tax, build the homes, balance the budget, and stop the crime. Who would have thought that a conservative government would be running on build the homes? And here they are. So this to me is really important point to make, which is all the political parties are in agreement on the importance of dealing with this issue. That doesn't happen often. And as a result, we should take it for what it is, which is a gift, and encourage all of them at every level to try to figure out how to move forward and take advantage of this moment in time when we're not at least arguing with one another about whether or not we should be involved in housing on a federal level. I mean, the argument now is how much and to what extent. And I want to give props to the Clean Economy Fund that brought us all together on this task force, looking at climate and what building all of these homes, the impact it's going to have on emissions. And I think that body of work will stand to be a great reference point for any governments in the future, provincial, municipal, and federal. And that came out of civil society. You know, they decided, well, we need to do something about this. We need answers. And it's not a government advisory council, which is what, because Lord knows I wouldn't be appointed to it. But that's why it's important.
I don't think any future federal government hides behind the Constitution that housing is a provincial responsibility. I think those days are over. It's been nearly 40 years of hiding behind that constitutional point, and I think that's come to an end. So whoever wins the next federal election is going to be thinking about 4 years hence whether they've moved the needle or not.
Yep.
And like that's an exciting change that we've seen in the political landscape.
So, I mean, really well said. We have had a long period of, as you say, sort of federal politicians in particular not talking about housing, then years and years of voters talking at them about housing, which means everybody in the political sphere is now talking about housing. To wind the clock back, how did we get here? How did we get to this point of Canada having such an extreme level of housing unaffordability? And I ask that as a way of talking about, you know, getting into the conversation of how do we get out of it. But Jennifer, how did we end up here?
Well, I'm glad you started with me because you have to go way back to how we plan land. So as a land use planner, I usually start there, but I do think this problem actually starts there, which is how we use land and how we build infrastructure. So over the course of the past decade, 75% of all new homes in the Canadian context has been on greenfield development. Now, the tricky thing about greenfield development, and this was a really critical and key point for our task force, so it was the #1 recommendation, was getting where we build homes right. The challenge with building on greenfield development is that it's incredibly expensive to build new infrastructure. Just imagine, in your mind's eye, a farmer's field. Now you need to put in roads, you need to put in water infrastructure, storm water, you need to build schools. Oh, how are we gonna get transit out here? Or everyone's gonna have to drive a car. It's tremendously labor intensive to do this. And as we're building that sprawl, which is delivering very little housing in relation to the level of effort and in relation to the level of government investment in infrastructure, We've been focused on that across this country as we've had, City of Toronto. It doesn't take a rocket science to figure out that a vast majority of Toronto could very easily be redeveloped. We have surface parking lots around our transit stations. We can easily put that parking below grade and build housing above. But instead, what have we done over the past decade? And we've had plans to build intense urban developments around our transit stations for almost 20 years now. But still during that time period, we've mostly built on greenfields across this country. So all of our effort, all of our money has been going into something that delivers very little when it comes to housing. Like the return that you get from your infrastructure dollars, from your construction workers, is very low if you're building a low-rise suburban community. You just don't get much out of that. And that may make sense in 1970 when you have a much smaller population, but it doesn't make sense if you care about the environmental footprint of what we're building and having a lower impact, but also if we care about using existing infrastructure and building more quickly, because you can actually build more quickly where you already have water, where you already have sewers, where you already have parks and schools. You can build more quickly in those places. So I would say, where did we go wrong? Well, we really didn't pivot and adapt around the type of development we were creating and delivering on, walkable communities and urban communities. And our highest growth in the past decade in this province, just because some of you might say, well, that's not what people want. Our highest growth has been right here in downtown Toronto. That's where our highest level of growth has been. Why? Well, because people want to live in downtown Toronto and people want to live without a car. Not everyone does, but a significant number of people do. And that's why there's been so much growth here. It's been market driven. So we've been spending a lot of money and time in something that isn't really the future and diverts us from building at scale, which is what we need to do today. We need to build urban, walkable, high quality, green, livable communities. And when we get that right, when we deliver on the promise, it's fantastic. And there's examples in Toronto, there's examples in Vancouver where we've gotten it right. We just need to do more of that.
Richard, do you want to follow up on that, on sort of where we went wrong, but continuing on what we could do right?
What Jennifer said, I absolutely agree with, and I think that was very much embedded in the report that we wrote. I would layer on, the retreat of federal government in the 80s and 90s from housing, the ticking time bomb that took maybe a few decades to really explode, but it's exploding. That's part of the equation. We've not matched the right kind of housing with the immigration that we've brought in. We love immigration in this country, in this city, but student housing. I know you've written about this, Tony. We are way behind all countries, all competing countries in terms of purpose-built student housing, and that's thrown itself onto the mainstream market, and so that's been a problem. I think that with some of the demand side equations. I think that we also acknowledge that while our city has grown, and Jennifer, you've made this point many times, our neighborhoods have shrunk. They're shrinking, and we've allowed that to happen too. And as we look forward to the supply that we need to meet, and we're starting to do this, and I think there's encouraging signs, but we really have to intensify our single-family, quote-unquote, neighborhoods. There's a huge opportunity because we have to do it all. There's a lot of people say, well, the focus should be around transit-oriented development, around transit stations. Yes, it should be. But if you add up all of the transit stations in the GTA and put the density that we're imagining putting there, we're creating tens of thousands of units when we need hundreds of thousands, actually millions. So it's got to be a solution of supply everywhere except perhaps the greenfield. I totally agree with you. That is the one place where we should not be growing as rapidly as we have been for decades now.
And Lisa, I'll turn to you on the politics of this, because Canadian housing, particularly in a city like Toronto and cities like Vancouver, started to become less and less affordable way back in the 90s. And yet there wasn't, it didn't really enter politics until fairly recently. Why was that? What was the barrier that kept us from doing things earlier rather than getting to the crisis point?
Because fundamentally, the federal government can only do one or two things at a given time. And let's go all the way back. Let's go to Mulroney. What was that? Constitutional crisis, free trade with the United States. Chrétien and Martin taking the deficit away because we were getting a terrible rating. And at the end of it, it was 9/11, dealing with security and all the changes in transportation. Harper government, the Great Recession, and then going into deficit and then wanting to come out of deficit. These are the things that actually took up all the mind for the Liberals in 2015. Legalizing cannabis and climate change. Those are the two things that they really focused on. So, and then they got the pandemic. So, you know, there's other things that are more urgent given the circumstance at the time that the efforts have to go into. But I would submit that right now, this one is pretty urgent. And where Anne McClellan and I, Anne's former Deputy Prime Minister, Liberal side, she and I talk about this, you know, where did it go wrong? And I guess what we agreed on is that everyone has a little bit to blame, but it's what Richard said. It's the immigration side of it. No one was doing the matching of ensuring that where people were going, there was going to be enough housing. And I saw it on the ground 4 years ago in Sydney, Nova Scotia, when 6,000 international students were brought into a community of 18,000, and there was no housing. And I thought, wow, we're in trouble. And that's when I first noticed it, and it had taken 3 years for it to work its way through the system.
Okay, let's talk about solutions now. And again, I'm going to try to push you to make it a bit of an elevator pitch. And we'll start with Jennifer. But like, what is a key thing or key things that we really need to do to make some progress?
Well, this might sound like it's not specific enough, but I think it's the thing we're not talking about yet that we really need to talk about, which is culture. We do not have a culture of execution at any level of government. You know, there were lots of great announcements made over the past couple of weeks by both the province and the feds, both of them recycled announcements from before, and it was very confusing if you don't follow closely. It sounded like there were tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars being announced. Some of that money was spent 5 years ago. We've got a political culture around people wanting to show they're getting something done that is deeply problematic. And then we have an execution culture that is deeply problematic, and it's trickling down into, with all due respect to my banking friends in the room, you know, we spend a lot of time on our developments waiting for banking documents. We're like waiting to get banking documents to get the land loan so that we can start the environmental, so that we can get a crane on the site. But, oh, we have to wait 2 more weeks to get the banking documents to get the loan. So there's like just every part of the culture involves a tremendous amount of waiting and trying to figure things out in a really bespoke way. I think we have to fix the culture in this country. We have to be execution-oriented. We're not today in any sector.
Richard, what are the key thing or key things for you that have to change?
Well, I find myself agreeing again with Jennifer on that point, so I'll make another one, and that is affordability in housing. Right now, the hole in the bottom of the bucket is perhaps our biggest issue. We in Toronto, for example, we are losing 15 affordable units for every one that we're adding each year for the last several years. And we can't build our way into affordability if we keep losing all that affordable out at the bottom of the bucket. And one of the solutions that has crept into the federal budget, something that BC has been fairly robust on, the City of Toronto itself through its MURA program is signaling, all without enough resources, mind you, is allowing not-for-profits through federal, through government to acquire existing apartment buildings and trying to lessen the amount of affordability that's being lost in the private stock, and find a deal with the private owners right now to buy up some of that stock and convert that into not-for-profit or publicly owned housing stock right away. Those units exist, but they're losing them at, a rate of 15 to 1. So I'm going to say we've got to fix the hole in the bottom of the bucket as being another major priority.
And Lisa, what are the key things for you that we have to change, that we have to improve on?
I wish that politicians would stop over-promising and under-delivering, to be honest, but that's kind of what our stock and trade is, so I don't know how we get around that. But I think we should make sure that we take a look at places where there are successes, and one of the ones that we highlighted in the report are Indigenous communities who are going through their approval processes very quickly because they know what they want to do, they understand their land, and they have planning that goes 7 generations, and they are going to implement it because it's an urgency for them. Maybe we can learn from there.
Well, just to pick up on that, they don't have to adhere to municipal processes.
That was what I was going to try to say, but without saying it.
But nor do universities and colleges as of Bill 185.
As well, of Bill
going through the
105,
legislature
exactly.
right now.
So, but I think that it's really important to call that out. Why are they so fast? Well,
Yeah.
because they're not going through the bureaucratic mess that.
You mean they're
every other-
removing the gatekeepers? That was easy, sorry.
No, talk. There's a good line. Talk a little bit more about that. About how much gatekeeping our gatekeepers are doing. Richard,
Listen, I get the gatekeepers. It's a good shot, and I think it's reasonably fair if you look at recent history. And Jennifer's making the point that it's current times too. But it's gatekeepers is a little bit of a pejorative, of course. I think we're also saying that maybe we don't like planning. Well, we still need planning. We just need planning to move faster. We need planning to be right. We cannot build, 100-story condo forests by a suburban train station and say we've accomplished what we need to accomplish. We have to build, I'm going to use some old language, complete communities. We need to build some 15-minute communities that actually have the libraries, the parks, all of the amenities that make living possible without having to move far. And that is kind of getting caught up in this gatekeeper rhetoric a little bit, I think. We're thinking just let her rip, get government completely out of the way, and we're going to build the kind of cities we want. I worry about that. At the same time, I also get the fact that we are not executing on approvals and permits, and that's also a problem.
Yep, I agree. I can't disagree with that.
And Jennifer, as former head gatekeeper, who also has a lot of criticisms of the gatekeeping process now because you are a developer, help us understand how much unnecessary, counterproductive gatekeeping is being done.
Well, first thing I'm going to say, and I have not actually said this in a public forum before, but I'm going to say it because I don't want to get caught up in some of these messes. But very recently at an event, someone came up to me, and I knew intuitively this was true, but someone came to me with the data, which was that when I was chief planner, 86% of complex applications were approved within 18 months. A year after I left, that was down to 36. The next year, it was down to 23.
Wow.
So I just want to say that on the one hand, I was a gatekeeper, but I was moving shit through, and I was doing it really aggressively.
Yeah.
Mirvish Village, The Well, Unilever, Celestica, all of these, most of what you see under construction went through in that period where we were very aggressively getting housing built, and we were focusing on the big deliverables. We were focusing on how we could get large projects through so that we could focus on scale. So after I left, an interesting thing happened when you talk about resources. Well, the planning department almost doubled in size as response times went into the toilet. So more bureaucracy, less being delivered. I think we need to start, that's why I'm so obsessed right now with this issue of culture, because I'm like, wait a minute, what happened there? You can't claim you don't have enough people. You've got more people than ever, and you're delivering more slowly than ever. So I think that we actually have to start talking about that, because I think it's a very, very real problem. I also think it's telling that entities that have the capacity to skip the municipal process, like First Nations groups, are way out ahead in being able to deliver. What does that tell you?
Yep.
And I couldn't agree more with Richard. We can't throw planning out the window. But I do think that planning has become obsessed about a lot of inconsequential minutia. And a lot is getting approved at the board with very little changes from what was originally submitted. And it's getting built, and everyone's saying, wow, that's an awesome, gorgeous project. Why did it take 5 years to get it approved? So for some reason, the pendulum is like way over where it shouldn't be right now, and we've got to get it back into an area that's more reasonable, because we have very costly processes right now that are infuriating, more infuriated than ever are not-for-profit organizations. They can't go through that process. It's so costly and so labor-intensive. You need to be deeply resourced to be able to go through the approvals process to get something built. So the pendulum right now is swinging way, way in the other direction. We need to get it back, and I think it does come back to leadership. Leaders create cultures within organizations, and we need some really big culture shifts happening in this city, in other cities across this country. And I do think the planning profession, and I say this as a professional planner, should be on trial right now. I think that we should be holding planners more accountable. And I say that as someone who sits across the table from planners, and I get thrown like this kind of crazy minutia, and I'm like, dude, like, get your head on straight. There's people living in a tent across the street, and you're worrying about a cantilever that's a foot over the sidewalk. Like, there's literally people living in a tent across the street. Give your head a shake. Like, you've totally lost the plot on what we're trying to build here in terms of building a country where people have homes where they can thrive at all stages of life.
Yeah.
And yet we're obsessing about these little tiny things. So I do think, I think that is a culture problem, and I do think that we have built up bureaucracies that now need to be trimmed right back because they're part of the problem. And I never thought I would say that, but I'm seeing it today.
I'm going to ask you all a question from the audience, which is, okay, so we need to build more, we need to build better, and yet right now we actually have some downward pressures on our ability to build because of high interest rates, high construction costs, projects being canceled because of those costs, making it not economic. So, Richard, I'll start with you. What do we do to sort of change that equation to make it easier to build and more likely that projects get greenlit by their investors or by government?
Well, I don't know how to lower interest rates. I'd be on a different panel if I did, but I would say that historically, these are the times when not-for-profit and government-led housing projects have sometimes seen upticks, when they can run counter-market. There's availability of labor, not necessarily as engaged right now. Access to capital potentially could be made cheaper. So there are opportunities to begin to turn the needle or move the needle in the direction of non-private sector as well. But we're not getting out of this without the private sector being the major workhorse and all this, and I 100% get that. And I do think that some of this is beyond public policy lever control, but I think what we can do is be ready to move when the economy allows, much more expeditiously than we have been. What Jennifer said was extraordinarily bold words in a public environment, I must say, and I commend you on it, for a developer to actually call out some of the crap that's going on inside of the processes of municipal approvals all the way through to permits, not just planning, not just zoning, is rare, and I commend you for doing that.
Lisa, thoughts on what we do to try to push down the cost of getting things built?
I'm going to defer to the experts on this one. I told you, Tony, I'd say that. It's fine. I'll defer to the expert. Look, I'll give you an example of good intentions not necessarily hitting their mark in a federal program, right? So in the case of universities, I sit on the board of St. Francis Xavier University out in Antigonish, Nova Scotia. They have 2 residence buildings, which if they had some investment would be able to convert them and alleviate the problem that Antigonish has in terms of having housing, getting more students on campus as opposed to them taking up off-campus spots. But a technicality disallows them from applying for the actual program that's in place through the federal government. I mean, you would think that these are easy tweaks, but they're not, because you have to reprofile. You got to go through Treasury Board. You got to go through committees. It's a myriad of regulatory, nightmares in order to get through there. So that's kind of an example for me in terms of to answer your question in a roundabout way.
I would just pick up on that and saying, I mean, we've seen moments of great alignment of all levels of government before, and not much happened. Like with the Martin McGuinty-Miller era did not move transit the way it was expected. It was much later that all happened. And so we're at a moment now of some alignment, yes, but to Lisa's point, I mean, the disconnects, the lack of stackability of policy, we are seeing too many projects at one level of government not being able to avail themselves of the well-intended but wrong-headed policies of another level of government. The federal government, I think, at times gets a little bit too fancy with its public policy. And while we like the demands, perhaps, of intensification around transit and so on that we see in the budget, if those policies serve as disconnects to money flowing or policy happening, they're really not doing anything. Yeah. So we absolutely, that's a hugely important point.
Yeah. And just before I turn to Jennifer, I just want to compliment Lisa for doing for saying, I don't have a good answer for this, and then having an absolutely awesome, an extremely detailed answer. Okay, I don't even have to ask Jennifer a question. I just have to say, Jennifer.
Under promise, man, under promise. New mantra.
Exactly, well done. So I just want to pick up on both of those themes, and in particular the theme that Richard raised. So, I just talked about the worst of times. I'm going to talk about the best of times again, because I do spend most of my life living in, these are the best of times. How are we going to do the best things possible? And I do think it is an opportunity. We have an opportunity now for new types of collaborations between the private and the public sector. And we are seeing that happen at all levels of government. The federal government, in their housing action plan that they launched, picked up on one of our recommendations around public lands. And they are breathing new life into their federal lands strategy and putting programs and policies in place to support provinces and municipalities that want to use existing land that they own in order to deliver on housing. And I used the easiest example, which is a site where you've got surface parking where the parking can go below grade and you can build housing above. That should be a no-brainer. That should be happening across this entire region at all our GO stations. But they also have been talking about the next layer, which is a really critical piece, which is we have one-story schools where we could be building a new school vertically, schools with a tremendous amount of deferred maintenance. The population has declined. Why are we not rebuilding a 3-story school, right-sizing the school, building housing above, building a state-of-the-art school, and using that land in a better way? One-story libraries. We have places where we could expand the library capacity and build housing above. So I think that, to me, is one of the most exciting things that we're seeing right now. Yeah. And that's something where there is alignment between all 3 levels of government. And I should say, the City of Toronto has jumped into action on that. And the City of Toronto has a very aggressive strategy and plan around their own lands, and has the agencies and I think the motivation at this point in time to really move very quickly on that. And we have a partnership on a site with the City of Toronto and with Creatio, and the team has been out of this world, absolutely fantastic to work with. That's in the best of times category, and that's where I think we should have a lot of hope. Yeah. And not-for-profit organizations can partner on those development sites to deliver, to get to the deeply affordable part that you're talking about. People like us, we can build it and then partner with the not-for-profit that then operates geared to a certain constituency that has very specific needs. So I think that is something that is incredibly exciting, and those deals will work all day long. To get to your question about interest rates and rising construction costs, those deals, the municipality or the province or the feds, they can pull the levers in how the deal is structured to be structured in today's economy, and they can make those projects viable for today. So I think that's where there's a lot of hope, and we have a lot of land between all 3 levels of government where we can do a lot of great city building and delivering on multiple objectives.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I could just tack in. I agree, certainly in the immediate term and maybe the short term, that the partnerships with not-for-profits and for-profit is undoubtedly the way to go. But at some point, we need to rebuild the capacity for not-for-profits and government-led development to be the lead. we've lost that, and it's decimated. It doesn't exist. You can't find it in short order. But we need to rebuild that. It can't always be in partnership, would be my concern. And we may disagree on that, but I just think that point needs to be made from my perspective.
I'll just say a small counterpoint, which is, transit is a public good. Everyone agrees. It's paid for by the government. But the private sector builds it because the private sector knows how to build it.
They didn't always.
I
And
know,
they haven't
but
done such a great job.
They do now, but
making a project.
my only point is I actually do think we have a lot of other very baseline challenges that we're trying to solve in government. Like if you can't approve a project, how on earth are you going to get the capital, hire the construction company, hire the architects?
Short term, I agree.
So I think that I don't disagree that building out broader capacities and infrastructures across a variety of industries, but right now, we have developers who know how to build housing.
I agree.
Who are sitting at home and not building it.
That's right.
They're literally sitting at home and not building today because there's too many barriers in the process. So I think the very first thing we need to do is get the folks who know how to building again, and they're not building right now. They stepped back last year or even just a little over last year. We've got to get the industry back in the room.
So we could probably stay up here for about another 8 hours. We could, they could bring us dinner. We could keep going. Unfortunately, we're almost at the end of our time. So what what I'd like us to do is just go down the line and talk about if we get everything right, if we could get everything right, what would be the better place that we could end up in briefly 10 years from now, let's say? How could things look 10 years from now? And I'll start with Lisa and go down the line. What are we trying to get to, and what would that look like?
I think 10 years from now, I would just like to see a poll for people under the age of 40 telling me that they're not as unhappy in this country as they currently are, because they're really, really unhappy. And even moving that happiness index, I think, means a lot in terms of public policy. So I would measure that as the outcome, not how many houses, not what's going on, just whether or not we're getting it right for the people who really matter.
Richard?
That generation would say you guys didn't talk enough about climate in this panel, and they wouldn't be wrong. And I think that we need to move both those two things. We can't go back to the headiest times of the industry and expect good outcomes for the environment. We are heading in a direction with how we are building that is going to blow Canada's carbon budget in this industry alone.
Yeah.
And so we have to transform for affordability reasons, but also for climate reasons, how we build going forward. And we haven't talked about industrial strategy and all the various things that our report does reference very strongly, one of the central points, in fact. But we need to transform this industry into something that is very different than the industry we've known all our lives.
Final word to Jennifer.
I think I'll pick up on both Lisa and Richard's points, which is I think if 10 years from now we got this right, we're looking at a very different landscape in terms of our city. And for one thing, it's a city where young people are raising their families without being petrified that they're not going to be able to house their children, where people are not really limiting their family planning. They don't want to have kids because they're like, I don't know how I'm going to live in this city. But something else has happened, which is we've actually created really dense, beautiful urban neighborhoods that are very green, that offer really high quality of life, where very few people even think about owning a car because you just don't need to, because you can walk and cycle safely everywhere. And you have a state-of-the-art gorgeous school outside your door, a state-of-the-art gorgeous park outside your door, and you can walk your children to daycare, and you can then walk to work. You can hop on regional transit to go visit grandma and grandpa, or to go to cottage country, or do any other thing that you want to do. But we've really embraced a very different vision. And I will say that the risk right now is that this gets back to Richard's point about complete communities. We just keep jamming in more housing, and we don't think about creating beautiful, livable places, because just building housing will not make young people happy. No. We have to deliver on all the promises of urban living. Yeah. And we aren't yet doing that, but we can. We absolutely can. We know how. There's places where we've done it.
on that note, we're going to end. Thank the panelists for this wonderful conversation. Thank you all for being here. Wonderful.
Thank you, and I think I speak for all of us when I say that we probably could have gone another 2 hours quite happily, and I really, another 8 hours past dinner time. I really do appreciate the positive message. I mean, we do have a gift right now of alignment at political levels. Now, maybe we don't have everything stacking up the way it could, but the work that your panel has done and continues to do is very encouraging, and I also appreciate the 4-letter honesty too, just to really deliver, you know, call out what we need to change, and that is really refreshing. So thank you to all 3 of the panelists, and Tony, a great job as always. It's a pleasure to have you here, so thank you. Before we wrap, let me just highlight 2 events coming up. On May 9th, we have a panel on Canada's economic resilience, including, among others, Deputy Minister Simon Kennedy and Jennifer Bannister from Staircase Ventures. And then on May 23rd, we'll host our 2024 Private Equity Outlook with panelists from Hoop, Fengate, Brookfield, and Kensington Partners. Our website, canadianclub.org, has a lot more information for you to get your seats or to figure out how to register and join us online. As always, thank you to VVC Productions for producing and streaming the event today and making it available online. And lastly, thanks to everybody online and in the room for joining us. Have a lovely afternoon, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.